Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're leaving behind the noise of the modern world, the glow of phone screens, the endless stream of messages arriving in an instant, and traveling back to a time when every letter crossed a continent on the back of a single horse. Our journey begins in the spring of 1860, when the United States was a nation growing faster than its roads, its railways, or its means of communication. Vast prairies stretched beyond the horizon. Deserts shimmered beneath the western sun. Towering mountain ranges stood like silent walls between distant communities. And somewhere across those immense landscapes, riders carried the hopes, worries, and dreams of an entire nation inside a simple leather mail pouch. For just 18 remarkable months, these young horsemen raced across nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, changing horses every few minutes, riding through scorching heat, freezing snow, lonely deserts, and windswept plains. Their route would become one of the most legendary in American history, known simply as the Pony Express. Yet despite its legendary reputation, this isn't really a story about daring heroes or thrilling adventures. It's the story of ordinary mornings, of stable hands brushing horses before sunrise, of station keepers waiting quietly beside dusty trails, of blacksmiths repairing worn horseshoes by the glow of a forge, of cooks preparing simple meals in lonely cabins hundreds of miles from the nearest town, of families anxiously waiting for letters from loved ones they hadn't seen in months, and of young riders who often disappeared over the horizon, carrying messages that could change lives, businesses, governments, and sometimes even history itself. Tonight, we'll travel beside them. We'll ride through rolling grasslands where millions of buffalo once grazed beneath endless skies. We'll climb rugged mountain passes where the air grows cooler with every step. We'll cross rivers swollen with spring snowmelt, wander through silent deserts where only the wind keeps company, and visit isolated relay stations where fresh horses stand ready day and night. Along the way, we'll discover not only how the Pony Express worked, but how people lived, worked, rested, hoped, and endured across the American frontier during one of its most fascinating chapters. As always, there is no need to stay awake until the end. Simply allow the story to unfold at its own gentle pace. Let each quiet landscape replace the busy thoughts of your day. If sleep comes before our journey is finished, then the Pony Express can continue its ride without you, carrying its letters beneath the stars while you drift peacefully into dreams. But before we begin, I have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy these relaxing history journeys, and you'd like to help more people discover them, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Whispered History. Every like, every subscription, and every kind comment tells YouTube that these slow, peaceful stories are worth sharing. It helps this little corner of quiet history continue to grow, allowing me to create many more long-form journeys through the past for you to enjoy. And if you're listening from somewhere around the world, I'd love to know where you're joining from tonight. Leave a comment below with your city or country. It's always wonderful to see how people from so many different places can gather together, united by a shared love of history and a good night's sleep. Now, dim the lights if you haven't already. Settle comfortably beneath your blankets. Take one slow, easy breath, and let us return to America in the year 1860. The nation was vast beyond imagination, from the busy harbors of the Atlantic coast to the booming towns of California. The United States stretched across a continent unlike any other. Yet despite its enormous size, it remained in many ways a collection of distant worlds, connected only by rough roads, winding rivers, and determination. Travel from New York to San Francisco could take weeks, sometimes months, depending on the weather, the season, and a little luck. News moved slowly, letters moved even more slowly. A businessman in St. Louis might wait over a month to hear whether a shipment had safely reached California. Parents living in Ohio could spend weeks wondering whether their son had arrived safely after heading west in search of gold. Government officials often made decisions using information that was already several weeks old by the time it reached Washington. Today, such delays seem almost impossible to imagine. A message that now crosses the globe in less than a second once depended entirely upon people, horses, rivers, weather, and countless miles of open country. Yet for those living in 1860, patience was simply another part of daily life. Every letter carried weight. Every newspaper was eagerly shared. Every scrap of news from the distant West felt valuable. America itself was changing with astonishing speed. Only a few decades earlier, much of the land beyond the Mississippi River had remained unfamiliar to most Americans. Explorers had mapped its rivers, traders had crossed its plains, native nations had lived upon these lands for countless generations, and scattered military forts marked isolated points along the frontier. But now, everything seemed to be moving westward. New farms appeared where tall prairie grasses had once swayed untouched. Small settlements grew into bustling towns. Wagon trails became busy roads. Merchants packed their wagons with tools, fabric, coffee, books, and hopes for prosperity. Gold discoveries in California had drawn hundreds of thousands of people toward the Pacific coast during the previous decade. Cities expanded almost overnight. San Francisco transformed from a modest settlement into one of America's busiest ports. Steamships arrived daily carrying passengers from around the world, while sailing ships crowded the harbor like floating forests of wooden masts. Yet despite this incredible growth, California still felt unimaginably distant from the nation's eastern cities. Between them stretched nearly 2,000 miles of grasslands, rivers, deserts, mountain ranges, and isolated frontier country. There were no airplanes, no automobiles, no completed transcontinental railroad, and perhaps most importantly, no telegraph line yet connected the Atlantic with the Pacific. Information traveled only as fast as people or animals could carry it. It was a challenge unlike any the young nation had ever faced. And somewhere, someone began wondering a simple question. What if the fastest mail in America wasn't carried by a stagecoach, but by a single rider and a fresh horse waiting just over the next hill? For generations, Americans had accepted that distance simply could not be hurried. If you wished to send a letter from New York to California, you packed it carefully, sealed it with wax, handed it to a postmaster, and then began to wait. Days would pass, then weeks, sometimes more than a month. The letter might travel by train across the eastern states, continue by riverboat, transfer to a stagecoach, perhaps even board a steamship, depending on the chosen route. Every leg of the journey introduced another delay, a flooded river, a broken wagon wheel, heavy snowfall in the mountains, or rough seas around Central America could add days before the message finally reached its destination. To people living in 1860, this was simply the way the world worked. But America itself was changing much faster than its mail. Every year, thousands more families packed their belongings into wagons and headed west. They crossed rivers, climbed mountain passes, and built new homes across the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountains in California. Small settlements became villages, villages became towns, and towns slowly grew into thriving cities. Among them, none expanded more dramatically than San Francisco. Only a dozen years earlier, it had been a modest settlement overlooking a magnificent harbor. Then, in 1848, gold was discovered in California. Within months, the news spread around the world. Ships arrived from Boston, New York, England, France, China, Australia, and South America. Fortune seekers poured into California by the tens of thousands. Merchants opened stores almost overnight. Hotels filled every room. Wharves extended farther into the bay to accommodate the endless stream of arriving vessels. Yet despite all its excitement, California still felt incredibly far away from the rest of the nation. Imagine opening a business in San Francisco. You order supplies from factories in the east, you send payment, then you wait and wait. Perhaps 5 weeks later, a reply finally arrives. By then, circumstances may already have changed completely. Prices rise, markets shift, ships depart, opportunities disappear. For merchants, slow communication was not simply inconvenient. It could determine whether a business succeeded or failed. The same was true for banks. Financial institutions depended upon current information. They needed to know exchange rates, shipments of gold, investment opportunities, and market prices across the country. But every important decision relied upon news that was already weeks old by the time it arrived. Government officials faced similar frustrations. The United States was growing rapidly, stretching from the Atlantic Ocean toward the Pacific. Governors, military officers, judges, and lawmakers all needed reliable communication. Decisions affecting Western territories often traveled back and forth so slowly that situations on the ground had already changed before new instructions arrived. Military commanders stationed at isolated frontier forts understood this better than anyone. Many forts stood hundreds of miles from the nearest large town. Supplies arrived only occasionally. Reports traveled slowly. A request for additional equipment or reinforcements could take weeks simply to reach Washington, followed by several more weeks before an answer returned. Patience became part of military life. Families understood patience as well. Perhaps nowhere was slow communication felt more deeply than inside ordinary homes. A mother in Missouri might watch her oldest son leave for California with a wagon train. Months later, she would receive a letter. He had arrived safely. He had found work. He missed home. She immediately sat down to write a reply, carefully choosing every word because she knew another month or more would pass before he read it. Then she waited once again. Sometimes weather delayed the mail. Sometimes accidents delayed it. Sometimes nothing arrived at all. Each knock upon the door became a small moment of hope. Letters carried far more than ink upon paper. They carried reassurance, news of births, announcements of weddings, stories of harvests, business agreements, political developments, expressions of love, condolences after loss. For many families scattered across the expanding nation, a single envelope represented their only connection with loved ones living thousands of miles away. Even newspapers depended upon faster communication. Editors constantly searched for fresh reports from Washington, New York, St. Louis, and California. But by the time newspapers reached readers, many stories were already old news. An election held in the East might not be widely reported in California until weeks later. A new law could be passed in Washington, while citizens on the Pacific Coast continued living under uncertainty until official documents finally arrived. America was becoming one country in geography, but not yet in communication. There were solutions, at least in theory. Some proposed expanding stagecoach routes. Others favored larger steamship services. Another possibility already existed, though only in part: the electric telegraph. Samuel Morse's invention had transformed communication across the eastern United States. Messages that once required days could suddenly travel along wires in minutes. Cities connected by telegraph experienced an entirely new speed of information. Businesses embraced it. Newspapers loved it. Government offices quickly recognized its value. Yet in 1860, the telegraph had one enormous limitation. Its wires ended long before they reached California. Thousands of miles of mountains, deserts, rivers, and isolated plains still separated the eastern and western networks. Building a single telegraph line across such vast country presented an extraordinary engineering challenge. Workers would need to transport poles, wire, tools, food, and equipment across landscapes where roads barely existed. Until that line could be completed, another solution would have to bridge the gap. It needed to be dependable. It needed to be remarkably fast. And perhaps most importantly, it needed to prove that rapid communication across the continent was actually possible. Three businessmen believed they had found exactly that answer: William Hepburn Russell, Alexander Majors, and William Bradford Waddell. Together, they already operated one of the nation's largest freight and stagecoach companies. Their wagons hauled supplies across thousands of miles. Their drivers knew the frontier better than almost anyone. Their stations stretched across much of the American West. Looking at their existing network, they imagined something wonderfully simple. Instead of asking one exhausted horse to carry a rider for hundreds of miles, why not keep fresh horses waiting every 10 or 15 miles? The rider would arrive, leap from one saddle to the next, exchange the mail pouch, and continue almost immediately. The horses would rest. The mail would never stop moving. Instead of a weary stagecoach lumbering slowly across the plains, the continent would become a relay race. One rider, one horse, then another and another, day and night, across rivers, across mountains, across deserts, across nearly 2,000 miles of American wilderness. It sounded almost impossible. Many people believed it could never work. The distances were simply too great, the weather too unpredictable, the expense too enormous. Yet the idea possessed something deeply appealing. It reflected the optimism of a young nation convinced that determination could overcome almost any obstacle. If America intended to unite two distant coasts into one country, then someone first had to prove that even its greatest distances could be crossed with speed, discipline, and unwavering resolve. Soon, construction crews would begin preparing hundreds of relay stations. Blacksmiths would shoe hundreds of horses. Carpenters would raise lonely cabins across empty landscapes. Stable hands would fill haylofts with fresh feed. And somewhere, young riders would begin arriving, not yet realizing they were about to become part of one of the most famous mail routes in American history. Turning an ambitious idea into reality would require far more than courage. It would demand careful planning, thousands of miles of preparation, hundreds of skilled workers, and an understanding of the American frontier unlike anything attempted before. The three partners behind the project, William H. Russell, Alexander Majors, and William B. Waddell, already knew the West better than most Americans. For years, their freight company had hauled supplies to military forts, mining camps, and growing settlements across the frontier. Their wagon trains carried everything from barrels of flour and sacks of coffee to lumber, tools, clothing, and government equipment. Their drivers understood every river crossing, every dangerous canyon, every dependable spring, and every lonely stretch of prairie where travelers might ride an entire day without seeing another soul. This knowledge became their greatest advantage. Rather than inventing a completely new route, they decided to build upon trails that already existed. The Pony Express would begin in St. Joseph, Missouri, a bustling river town perched on the eastern edge of the frontier. Here, steamboats arriving from the Mississippi River unloaded passengers and cargo destined for the West. Standing along the Missouri River in 1860, one could feel the excitement of a nation still expanding. Wagons rattled over dusty streets. Merchants displayed tools, blankets, boots, and flour inside busy storefronts. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron beneath open workshops. Teamsters shouted to one another as teams of oxen pulled heavy freight wagons toward the edge of town. For many travelers, St. Joseph represented the last taste of city life before weeks of wilderness. From there, the Pony Express route would head west across Kansas Territory, through present-day Nebraska, climb into the rugged mountains of Wyoming, cross the valleys of Utah, continue over Nevada's vast deserts, and finally descend into California before reaching Sacramento. Altogether, the journey covered nearly 2,000 miles. Looking at a modern map, the distance seems impressive. Standing upon the open prairie in 1860, it must have felt almost unimaginable. The challenge was not simply riding across this immense landscape. Fresh horses would need to be waiting at regular intervals, every hour of every day, throughout every season of the year. To make that possible, relay stations had to be built. Many already existed as stagecoach stops or trading posts. Others had to be constructed from scratch. Some stations were little more than sturdy log cabins, with a small corral nearby. Others consisted of adobe buildings in the deserts of the Southwest, their thick earthen walls helping keep interiors cool beneath the relentless summer sun. In the mountains, rough-hewn timber buildings stood against heavy winter snows, smoke curling gently from stone chimneys during the colder months. Regardless of size, every station served the same purpose. It was a place where speed never stopped. Inside each station, life followed a quiet but disciplined rhythm. Stable hands brushed horses, checked hooves, repaired worn bridles, and filled wooden troughs with fresh water. Hay was stacked carefully beneath dry roofs. Leather saddles were inspected each morning. Bits and reins were cleaned after every ride. Nothing could be left to chance. A loose strap, a missing horseshoe, or an exhausted horse could delay the entire system. The stations themselves were spaced according to the endurance of the horses rather than the riders. Most horses galloped between 10 and 15 miles before reaching the next relay point. There, a fresh mount waited. The rider would leap from one saddle, transfer a single piece of equipment called the mochila, and be on the trail again in little more than 2 minutes. The mochila became one of the most recognizable pieces of Pony Express equipment. Made from sturdy leather, it fit neatly over the saddle without requiring complicated straps or buckles. 4 locked pockets held the precious mail, important government documents, business contracts, newspapers, family letters. Everything traveled inside this carefully designed mail pouch. Because transferring the mochila was much faster than unloading individual bags, precious minutes could be saved at every station. Those minutes added up across nearly 2,000 miles. Even the saddles received special attention. Ordinary Western saddles were comfortable for long days of ranch work, but they were too heavy for the demanding pace envisioned by the Pony Express. Instead, lighter saddles were selected whenever possible. Every unnecessary pound mattered. The horses carried enough weight already. Most riders themselves weighed well under 125 pounds. Combined with lightweight equipment, the goal was to keep every horse as fast and agile as possible. Choosing the horses proved just as important as building the stations. There was no single perfect breed for every part of the journey. The broad grasslands east of the Rocky Mountains favored quick, energetic horses capable of sustained speed. In rough mountain country, sure-footed animals that remained calm on steep trails were far more valuable. Across Nevada's dry basins, endurance became essential as riders crossed long stretches beneath the blazing desert sun. The company purchased horses from many different sources. Some were sturdy Morgans, others carried bloodlines from thoroughbreds, compact Western Mustangs, descendants of Spanish horses that had roamed the plains for generations, also proved remarkably dependable. Each animal brought different strengths. Together, they formed one of the finest collections of riding horses assembled in America. Supplying these stations required its own remarkable effort. Food had to be delivered, hay transported, water barrels filled where natural springs were scarce, blacksmith tools, nails, wagon parts, blankets, lantern oil, cooking supplies, and replacement tack all had to reach places that often stood days away from the nearest settlement. Long before the first Pony Express rider ever carried a letter, wagon trains quietly traveled the route, delivering everything needed to keep the stations alive. Many station keepers lived in remarkable isolation. Weeks might pass with few visitors beyond the riders themselves. The silence became familiar. Morning chores blended into afternoon repairs. Evening meals were often simple, perhaps beans, bread, coffee, and salt pork cooked over a small iron stove. Yet, despite the loneliness, every station keeper understood their importance. If one station failed, the entire chain weakened. The Pony Express depended upon hundreds of ordinary people performing ordinary tasks with extraordinary consistency. There was little room for carelessness. One forgotten bucket of water, one neglected horse, one broken gate left unrepaired. Any small oversight might ripple across hundreds of miles. As construction continued throughout the spring of 1860, the route slowly came to life. Cabins appeared where empty grasslands had stretched undisturbed only months earlier. Corrals filled with restless horses. Smoke drifted from newly built chimneys. Lanterns glowed softly in lonely windows after sunset. Piece by piece, station by station, mile by mile, an invisible bridge was forming across the American continent. It was not made of iron rails, nor telegraph wires. Instead, when it was built from timber, leather, horses, determination, and the quiet dedication of hundreds of people whose names would rarely appear in history books. Soon, only one final piece remained. Someone would have to climb into the saddle, take hold of the reins, and ride. With the stations prepared, the horses selected, and the route stretching across nearly 2,000 miles of wilderness, one question remained: who would actually ride it? The answer surprised many people then, and it still surprises many people today. The Pony Express riders were not seasoned frontiersmen with long gray beards or celebrated military veterans. Most were remarkably young. Many were still teenagers. Some had only recently left home. Others had spent their lives working with horses on farms, ranches, or stagecoach lines. They understood animals instinctively. They knew how to calm a nervous horse, how to cross a swollen creek, and how to keep riding long after fatigue began whispering that it was time to stop. Youth, more than strength, became one of their greatest advantages. A lighter rider meant less weight for the horse to carry. Every pound mattered. The company preferred riders who weighed no more than about 125 pounds, including their clothing and equipment. It wasn't a question of appearance, but of endurance. Over hundreds of miles, A lighter load allowed horses to maintain their speed while remaining healthier throughout the journey. Height mattered far less than skill. A smaller rider with excellent balance was often more valuable than someone taller and stronger. Balance could not be measured with a scale, yet it determined everything. A skilled horseman moved with the rhythm of the animal rather than against it. He conserved both his own energy and that of his mount. Every movement became smoother, quieter, and more efficient. Most applicants already possessed years of riding experience. On the frontier, horses were not hobbies. They were daily companions. Children often learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk. By adolescence, many young men had spent countless hours herding cattle, delivering supplies, checking fences, or traveling between scattered settlements. For them, a saddle felt almost as familiar as a chair. Still, riding the Pony Express demanded something different: speed, precision, consistency. A rider could not simply gallop recklessly across the landscape. He had to know exactly where the trail disappeared beneath tall prairie grass. He had to recognize river crossings, rocky ground, muddy stretches, and safe paths through narrow mountain passes. Sometimes the trail itself became little more than faint wagon ruts disappearing toward the horizon. There were no road signs, no fences marking every turn, only experience, careful observation, and memory. Before receiving regular assignments, many riders became familiar with their section of the route. The Pony Express worked like an enormous relay race. No single rider crossed the entire continent. Instead, each man rode a specific section, usually between 75 and 100 miles, divided into several shorter stages between relay stations. By riding the same territory repeatedly, they came to know every bend in the trail. They remembered where streams ran deepest after spring rains. They recognized lonely cottonwood trees standing beside distant creeks. They knew which hills offered shelter from strong winds, and where snow tended to drift across mountain paths during winter. The land itself gradually became familiar. In many ways, it became another companion. Their clothing reflected practicality rather than fashion. Heavy coats might provide warmth, but unnecessary weight slowed both rider and horse. Loose garments could catch on branches or equipment. Most dressed simply: a sturdy shirt, strong trousers, reliable boots, a broad-brimmed hat to shield the eyes from sun and rain. During colder months, heavier coats and gloves became essential, especially in the mountains, where snow sometimes lingered well into spring. Nothing was worn merely for appearance. Every piece of clothing served a purpose. Even personal belongings were kept to a minimum. There was little room for unnecessary possessions. The mail always came first. Many riders carried only the essentials: a canteen, perhaps a small knife, sometimes a revolver. Popular stories often describe Pony Express riders constantly engaged in dramatic gunfights. Reality was usually much quieter. Firearms certainly existed on the frontier, and some riders chose to carry them, particularly through remote sections where help might be many miles away. But their greatest protection was rarely a weapon. It was speed, a fast horse, good judgment, and avoiding unnecessary risks proved far more valuable than seeking confrontation. The company wanted riders to deliver mail, not trouble. Food along the route was equally simple. There were no elaborate meals waiting at relay stations. A rider arriving after a fast stretch might swallow a quick cup of coffee, eat bread, beans, bacon, or dried meat, exchange horses, and continue almost immediately. Long conversations could wait for another day. Time remained precious. Station keepers understood this rhythm perfectly. As soon as hoofbeats approached, everyone sprang into motion, fresh horse ready. mochila transferred, quick drink. Perhaps a few brief words. Then the rider disappeared once again, leaving only drifting dust and fading hoofbeats behind. Sleep followed a similarly unpredictable pattern. Unlike travelers riding at a leisurely pace, Pony Express riders worked according to schedules rather than daylight. Some began before sunrise, others rode through the afternoon. Many found themselves crossing lonely stretches beneath brilliant moonlight while countless stars filled the western sky. Whenever their assigned section ended, they rested, sometimes for only a few hours. Then another ride awaited. Despite the demanding work, many young men eagerly sought these positions. The pay was considered respectable for the time. More importantly, the job carried a certain quiet prestige. The Pony Express represented something entirely new, fast, modern, ambitious. Successful applicants understood they were participating in an experiment that captured the imagination of newspapers across the country. Friends admired them. Families worried about them. Children dreamed of becoming riders themselves. Yet beneath the growing reputation, daily life remained surprisingly ordinary. A rider woke, checked his horse, adjusted the saddle, collected the waiting mail, then simply rode, hour after hour, day after day. There was a little applause waiting at the next station. No cheering crowds, only another horse, another stretch of trail, and another horizon beyond it. Perhaps that quiet routine explains why the Pony Express continues to fascinate people today. The riders performed extraordinary work, not because every day was filled with excitement, but because they repeated ordinary acts of discipline with remarkable consistency. They trusted their horses. The station keepers trusted them. The people waiting for letters trusted the entire system. Each person depended upon someone they might never meet. It became a chain of confidence, stretching across a continent. As spring gradually warmed the prairie grasses in 1860, the final preparations quietly came to an end. The relay station stood ready. Hundreds of horses waited inside freshly built corrals. Mailbags rested inside post offices. Station keepers watched the trails with growing anticipation. And somewhere in St. Joseph, Missouri, one young rider tightened the straps of his saddle, adjusted the leather mochila that would soon carry the nation's hopes and messages, placed one boot into the stirrup, and prepared to begin one of the most famous rides in American history. Long before people remembered the Pony Express riders, there were the horses. Without them, the entire idea would have remained nothing more than an ambitious dream. The riders often became legends, but the horses carried the greater burden. Every letter, every newspaper, every government document, every hopeful message from home moved across the continent because thousands of hooves struck the earth day after day, season after season. Unlike the powerful draft horses that pulled heavy wagons across the frontier, Pony Express horses were chosen for an entirely different purpose. They needed speed, endurance, quickness, and perhaps most importantly, a willing spirit. There was no single perfect breed. Instead, the company selected horses that best suited the different landscapes along the route. Across the rolling prairies of Kansas and Nebraska, lighter horses could stretch into long, graceful strides over relatively open ground. Here, speed mattered more than brute strength. Riders often covered these sections swiftly, the endless grasslands allowing horse and rider to settle into a steady rhythm beneath the enormous western sky. Farther west, conditions changed. The Rocky Mountains demanded something else entirely. Here, horses needed sure feet rather than remarkable speed. Narrow trails wound along steep hillsides, crossed rocky streams, and climbed through forests of pine and aspen. One careless step could mean a twisted leg or a dangerous fall. The horses that performed best in these regions possessed calm minds as much as strong bodies. Then came the deserts of Nevada. Few places tested horse and rider more quietly. Water became precious. Shade almost disappeared. During summer afternoons, shimmering waves of heat rose from the ground until distant hills seemed to float upon the horizon. The horses working these routes learned to conserve their strength. They moved steadily rather than recklessly, carrying their riders across long stretches where only scattered sagebrush interrupted the vast emptiness. Among the animals used by the Pony Express, Mustangs earned particular admiration. Their ancestors had arrived centuries earlier with Spanish explorers, and over generations many escaped or were released onto the open plains. Living freely across the American West, they adapted to difficult conditions that would challenge many other horses. Mustangs rarely appeared as large or elegant as expensive eastern breeds. Instead, they possessed something equally valuable: resilience. They knew how to travel long distances. They could survive harsh winters, dry summers, and sparse grazing land. Many frontiersmen respected them for precisely these qualities. Alongside the Mustangs came Morgans, thoroughbreds, and various mixed breeds raised on farms and ranches across the country. Each horse brought its own personality. Some remained calm, regardless of wind or weather. Others seemed eager to run the moment the reins loosened. A few became favorites among experienced riders, trusted companions whose dependable nature inspired quiet confidence. Unlike machines, horses could not simply be expected to perform the same way every day. They experienced fatigue. They startled at unexpected sounds. They became thirsty, hungry, sometimes stubborn. The men who cared for them understood this well. Before sunrise, while much of the frontier still slept beneath fading stars, stable hands quietly began their work. Lanterns glowed inside wooden barns. The scent of fresh hay filled the cool morning air. Horses stirred softly inside their stalls, ears turning toward familiar footsteps. One by one, each animal received careful attention. Their coats were brushed free of dust, hooves inspected for cracks or loose stones, leather bridles checked for worn stitching, blankets folded neatly, feed placed into wooden troughs, buckets filled with clean water. These simple routines rarely appeared in newspaper stories, yet they mattered enormously. A healthy horse was not created by chance. It depended upon countless small acts of daily care. Hay formed the foundation of most meals, often supplemented with oats whenever supplies allowed. Good nutrition helped horses recover after fast runs between relay stations. Fresh water proved equally important. Many stations stood beside streams or natural springs, but others relied upon wells, dug by hand, or barrels transported by wagon across considerable distances. During hot weather, station keepers watched carefully for signs of exhaustion, a horse breathing too heavily, sweating excessively, or showing unusual stiffness would be allowed additional rest whenever possible. The company could not afford unnecessary losses. Every horse represented both a valuable investment and an essential partner in the mail system. Shoeing the horses demanded equal skill. Blacksmiths became familiar figures along the Pony Express route. Inside their workshops, iron bars glowed orange within roaring forges. The rhythmic ringing of hammer against anvil echoed across nearby settlements. One by one, horseshoes were carefully shaped to match each hoof. A properly fitted shoe protected the animal across rocky ground, reduced unnecessary wear, and provided better footing on difficult trails. Even a single loose nail could eventually become a serious problem hundreds of miles from the nearest repair shop. The saddles also required constant attention. leather naturally stretched with use, stirrup straps weakened over time, buckles loosened. After nearly every ride, station workers inspected the equipment. Small repairs completed immediately prevented larger problems later. Nothing about the Pony Express relied upon luck. Preparation remained its greatest strength. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the system was how briefly each horse actually carried a rider. Unlike ordinary travel, where one animal might labor throughout an entire day, Pony Express horses usually galloped only 10 to 15 miles before reaching the next relay station. There, everything happened astonishingly fast. As the rider approached, the waiting station keeper already held a fresh horse by the reins. Dust rose beneath pounding hooves. The rider swung to the ground. The leather mochila lifted from one saddle and placed onto another. Within moments, often less than 2 minutes, the fresh horse was already racing toward the next station. The tired animal remained behind. Its work finished for the moment. It drank, rested, ate, recovered. Only because this cycle repeated itself hundreds of times could the Pony Express maintain such remarkable speed across an entire continent. The horses never traveled the full distance. Instead, each completed only its own small chapter of the journey. Together, they formed an unbroken chain stretching from Missouri to California. It is comforting to imagine these quiet relay stations after the rider disappeared beyond the horizon. The dust slowly settled. The stable returned to silence. A horse lowered its head toward fresh hay. Another splashed water from a wooden trough. Somewhere, a station keeper brushed sweat from a faithful animal's coat while speaking softly in words that history never recorded. The urgency belonged to the mail. Life at the stations quickly returned to its familiar rhythm. There was respect between riders and horses that rarely needed to be spoken aloud. Neither could accomplish the journey without the other. The rider provided direction. The horse supplied movement. Together, they trusted one another across rivers, grasslands, mountain passes, and lonely deserts where the nearest help might lie many miles away. Many years later, when people looked back upon the Pony Express, they naturally celebrated the young men who carried the mail. Yet perhaps the horses deserve equal remembrance. They asked for no recognition. They expected no applause. They simply answered the call each time hoofbeats approached, carrying another rider into the vast American landscape before quietly returning home to rest, ready to do it all again when the next letter arrived. When people imagine the Pony Express, they often picture a lone rider racing across an endless prairie beneath a bright blue sky. It is certainly a beautiful image, but the true journey was far more varied. No 2 days looked exactly alike. The trail crossed an entire continent, passing through landscapes so different that it sometimes felt as though the rider had traveled between separate worlds. Every few hundred miles, the land changed its character. The colors shifted. The air smelled different. The sounds changed. Even the light seemed to fall upon the earth in new ways. The journey began in St. Joseph, Missouri, where the broad Missouri River flowed steadily southward. Here, the eastern United States slowly gave way to the frontier. Beyond the last busy streets, the road stretched west. Almost immediately, the world grew quieter. Wooden fences became less common. Farmhouses stood farther apart. The horizon widened until the sky itself seemed to become the largest feature of the landscape across what is now Kansas. The prairie rolled gently in every direction. Tall grasses rippled like waves upon the sea whenever the wind swept across them. In spring, wildflowers added touches of purple, yellow, and white to the green fields. Butterflies drifted lazily between blossoms. Meadowlarks filled the morning air with cheerful songs. At sunrise, dew sparkled upon every blade of grass until the entire prairie shimmered beneath the first golden light. To someone arriving from the crowded cities of the East, the openness could feel almost overwhelming. There were few trees, few buildings. Nothing blocked the distant horizon. The land seemed to continue forever. The riders often traveled for miles, accompanied only by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind moving through the prairie grass. Occasionally, they passed wagon trains heading west. Families traveled together with oxen pulling heavy wooden wagons loaded with furniture, tools, barrels of flour, and treasured keepsakes packed carefully for the long journey ahead. Children sometimes waved excitedly as the Pony Express rider hurried past. Adults stepped aside to clear the narrow trail. Within moments, horse and rider disappeared once again into the distance. Crossing into present-day Nebraska, the route gradually followed the Platte River. The river itself rarely appeared dramatic. It flowed wide and shallow across broad sandy channels, reflecting the changing sky above. Travelers often joked that the Platte was a mile wide and an inch deep. Whether or not that description was entirely fair, the river became an important guide. Its valley offered dependable water, grass for grazing horses, and relatively level ground that made travel easier than crossing the surrounding hills. Cottonwood trees lined parts of its banks. Their leaves shimmered silver whenever the breeze stirred them. Waterfowl lifted gracefully from quiet backwaters. Beavers built dams along smaller streams. The entire valley seemed alive with movement. Farther west, immense herds of American bison still wandered portions of the plains. Although their numbers had already begun to decline, seeing thousands moving slowly across the prairie remained one of the most unforgettable sights on the frontier. From a distance, they resembled dark clouds drifting across the grass. Closer still, the ground trembled softly beneath countless heavy footsteps. The riders usually avoided disturbing them. There was little reason to interrupt such peaceful giants. As the trail continued, the prairie slowly gave way to rougher country. The horizon that had remained perfectly level for days suddenly rose into distant blue mountains. At first, they appeared almost like clouds. Then, with every mile, they grew larger. The Rocky Mountains announced themselves long before a traveler reached them. The air became cooler. The evenings arrived earlier in the valleys. Pine forests replaced endless grasslands. The scent of sun-warmed sage gradually mixed with fresh mountain air, carrying hints of evergreen and damp earth. Streams tumbled over smooth stones. Aspen trees shimmered with leaves that fluttered at even the gentlest breeze. Here, the trail demanded greater attention. Instead of long, straight stretches across open country, riders followed winding paths climbing steadily upward. Some trails hugged steep hillsides. Others crossed narrow wooden bridges spanning lively mountain creeks. The pace naturally slowed. Sure-footed horses became invaluable. From high ridges, breathtaking views unfolded in every direction. Layer upon layer of mountain peaks stretched toward the horizon, fading from green to blue to soft gray beneath distant skies. Few places on earth inspire quiet reflection quite like the mountains. Perhaps the riders noticed these views only briefly before continuing onward, or perhaps, during quieter moments, they allowed themselves a few seconds to admire the remarkable country through which they traveled. Descending into Utah, the landscape transformed once again. Wide valleys opened beneath towering peaks. Clear streams nourished patches of green surrounded by drier hills. Small settlements began appearing, their farms carefully arranged beside reliable water sources. Fruit trees, vegetable gardens, and neatly tended fields provided welcome signs of community after long stretches of wilderness. Travelers often appreciated these peaceful valleys, smoke rising from distant chimneys, children playing outside simple homes, church bells echoing softly across open fields. They offered gentle reminders that life continued quietly beyond the trail. Then, almost without warning, another dramatic change arrived. Nevada. Few parts of the journey felt more immense. Deserts stretched across broad basins bordered by long mountain ranges. The colors became wonderfully subtle: soft browns, pale gold, muted gray, occasional patches of green sagebrush. The sky seemed larger than ever before. Clouds drifted slowly above endless open spaces. During daylight, sunlight reflected brilliantly from pale rocks and dry earth. Toward evening, everything softened. Long shadows stretched across the valleys. The air cooled surprisingly quickly. Sunsets painted the western sky with shades of orange, rose, lavender, and deep blue. At night, the stars appeared astonishingly bright. With so few settlements nearby, darkness settled completely across the land. The Milky Way arched overhead like a glowing river of light. For riders traveling after sunset, the heavens themselves often became quiet companions. Finally, the Sierra Nevada mountains rose before the trail. Unlike the gradual approach to the Rockies, these mountains climbed abruptly from the surrounding landscape. Granite peaks reached toward the clouds. Dense forests covered the lower slopes. Clear rivers rushed through deep valleys carved over countless centuries. Snow often lingered upon the highest summits long after spring had arrived elsewhere. Crossing these mountains required patience, careful horses, and steady nerves. But beyond them, California waited. Descending the western slopes, travelers noticed another subtle transformation. The climate grew gentler. Oak trees replaced pines. Golden hills rolled toward fertile valleys. Fruit orchards appeared. Fields stretched across rich farmland nourished by rivers flowing from the mountains. Eventually, the trail reached Sacramento. Here, the long journey finally ended. Letters exchanged countless hands before arriving safely at their destination. Some continued farther toward San Francisco by steamboat. Others remained in Sacramento, bringing long-awaited news to merchants, families, government officials, and newspapers eager to learn what had happened nearly 2,000 miles away. Looking back upon the route as a whole, it seems almost unbelievable that one continuous trail connected so many different worlds. Rolling prairies, wide rivers, towering mountains, peaceful valleys, vast deserts, dense forests, fertile farmland. Each landscape possessed its own quiet beauty. Each demanded something different from horse and rider. And together, they formed one of the most extraordinary journeys ever undertaken in American history. A journey where every mile carried not only letters, but the growing connections of an expanding nation. For the Pony Express riders, the relay stations were places of movement. For the station keepers, they were home. While riders came and went in only a matter of minutes, the men and women who cared for the stations remained behind. Watching the season slowly pass across the frontier, their names rarely appeared in newspapers. Few became famous, yet without them, the Pony Express could never have operated for a single day. Imagine arriving at one of these lonely stations just before sunrise. The sky is only beginning to brighten. A thin ribbon of pale orange rests along the eastern horizon, while the last stars fade overhead. The morning air is cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. Somewhere nearby, a horse nickers softly inside the corral. Smoke curls gently from the stone chimney of a modest cabin. Inside, the station keeper is already awake. long before the first rider appears. There is work to do. A fire must be lit. Coffee begins to simmer inside a blackened iron pot. Perhaps a skillet of bacon crackles over the flames. Simple biscuits bake inside a cast iron Dutch oven. Breakfast is rarely elaborate. There is little time, and even fewer ingredients. Beans, salt pork, fresh bread when flour is available. Sometimes dried apples, sometimes preserved peaches. Meals depend almost entirely upon whatever supplies have recently arrived by wagon. Once breakfast is finished, the day's real work begins. The horses always come first. The station keeper walks toward the corral carrying buckets of fresh water. Some horses greet him eagerly. Others continue chewing hay without much interest. Each animal is inspected carefully. Hooves are checked for loose stones, legs examined for swelling, coats brushed clean of dried sweat and dust. Leather bridles are hung neatly upon wooden pegs. Blankets are folded. Nothing is hurried. Every task has been repeated so many times that it becomes almost second nature. Nearby, chickens scratch quietly beneath wagon wheels left beside the barn. If the station is fortunate enough to keep a small vegetable garden, someone waters rows of onions, bean, or squash before the afternoon heat arrives. Life at these isolated stations follows a surprisingly ordinary rhythm. There are fences to repair, roofs to patch after storms, wood to chop for cooking and warmth, water barrels to refill, harnesses to mend, tools to sharpen. The frontier rarely allows anyone to remain idle for long. Many stations are occupied by entire families. A husband may care for the horses while his wife prepares meals or tends a small garden. Children gather firewood, fetch water from nearby creeks, or help feed the animals. For young children growing up at these stations, isolation simply feels normal. Their playground is the prairie. Their neighbors may live 20 or 30 miles away. The arrival of every rider brings a welcome interruption to the quiet routine. Some stations stand closer to settlements where travelers occasionally stop for meals or fresh horses. Others exist in remarkable solitude. A cabin, a corral, a well, perhaps a small barn. Beyond that, only miles upon miles of open country. Weeks can pass without seeing unfamiliar faces. The wind becomes a familiar companion. So do the birds, the changing clouds, the steady passage of the sun across the sky. Loneliness undoubtedly visits these places from time to time, yet many who chose this life appreciated its quiet simplicity. There were no crowded streets, no noisy factories, no constant distractions. Instead, life moved according to nature's own gentle schedule. Spring brought fresh grass. Summer filled the prairie with wildflowers. Autumn painted cottonwood leaves brilliant shades of gold. Winter covered fences, rooftops, and distant hills with peaceful blankets of snow. The station keepers witnessed every subtle change. By afternoon, chores gradually slow. The horses rest beneath whatever shade they can find. Perhaps the station keeper sits for a few moments on a rough wooden bench outside the cabin. A gentle breeze rustles through nearby grass. The only sounds are insects humming softly, birds calling from distant trees, and the occasional creak of leather as a horse shifts its weight. Then, far away, something changes. At first, it is almost impossible to notice a faint rhythm, soft, steady, hoofbeats. The station keeper stands. He shades his eyes against the afternoon sun and gazes toward the trail. There, a tiny figure appears on the horizon. Horse and rider approach with astonishing speed. Dust rises behind them like a pale ribbon stretching across the prairie. Within moments, the peaceful station bursts into activity. A fresh horse is already waiting. The rider scarcely slows before swinging gracefully from the saddle. The leather maquila is lifted free and placed upon the waiting horse. Perhaps only a few hurried words are exchanged. Trails clear. Rivers high. Snow in the pass. Simple observations, nothing more. there's little time for conversation. The fresh horse lunges forward almost immediately. The rider disappears toward the next station. The entire exchange often lasts less than 2 minutes. Then, silence returns. The tired horse is led toward fresh water, its saddle removed, its neck gently rubbed with reassuring hands. The station keeper speaks softly while brushing away dried foam left by the fast ride. The animal lowers its head, grateful for rest. Soon, everything feels peaceful once again. This quiet rhythm repeats itself throughout the day. Sometimes riders arrive every hour. Sometimes weather causes small delays. Occasionally, several hours pass without anyone appearing at all. The station keeper waits patiently, watching, listening, always prepared. Night transforms the stations into entirely different places. Lanterns glow warmly inside cabin windows. The smell of wood smoke drifts through the cool evening air. Coyotes begin calling somewhere beyond the hills. Owls glide silently above nearby fields. The stars emerge one by one until the entire sky sparkles with countless points of light. Even after darkness settles across the frontier, the Pony Express does not stop. Somewhere out there, another rider is already approaching. The station keeper keeps one lantern burning. Fresh horses remain saddled. Coffee warms quietly beside the fire. Sleep comes only in short intervals, always ready to be interrupted by distant hoofbeats. There is something comforting about imagining these lonely cabins scattered across the American frontier. Small islands of light surrounded by immense darkness. Places where ordinary people performed ordinary work with extraordinary dedication. They did not seek recognition. They simply cared for horses, maintained buildings, prepared meals, kept the fire burning, and waited for the next rider. History often remembers dramatic moments. The station keepers remind us that great achievements are usually built upon countless quiet acts of responsibility. Every successful delivery, every letter safely carried across the continent, every rider who continued onward, depended upon someone waiting patiently at a lonely station, ready long before the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached the wind. Every journey along the Pony Express carried its own uncertainties, not because danger waited around every corner, but because nature could never be predicted. Unlike modern roads, the Pony Express followed trails shaped by rivers, weather, mountains, and countless years of travel. Every sunrise brought a new set of conditions. A path that had been smooth yesterday might become muddy overnight. A quiet stream could transform into a rushing river after heavy rain. A clear mountain pass might disappear beneath fresh snow. For the riders, uncertainty became part of everyday life. Perhaps the greatest challenge was the weather. On the Great Plains, the sky itself seemed to possess a personality. Some mornings began with gentle sunshine, soft breezes, and endless blue stretching from horizon to horizon. The prairie grasses swayed peacefully, and meadowlarks filled the air with cheerful songs. Then, almost without warning, dark clouds would begin gathering far away. At first they appeared harmless, small patches of gray drifting above the distant prairie. Within an hour, they might grow into towering thunderheads reaching high into the atmosphere. The wind shifted, the air cooled, birdsong faded. The first drops of rain struck the dusty trail. Soon, lightning flashed across the enormous sky, illuminating miles of open grassland in brilliant white for only an instant before everything returned to shadow. Thunder followed a few moments later, rolling across the plains like distant cannon fire. For a rider caught in the open, there was little shelter, few trees, few buildings, only the vast landscape stretching in every direction. Rain quickly transformed dusty paths into slippery ground. Horses slowed naturally, choosing careful footing over speed. Their instincts often proved wiser than impatience. Spring introduced another challenge. Snow melting high in the mountains poured into rivers across the frontier. Streams that had been easy to cross only days before suddenly became wider, deeper, and far more powerful. Many crossings had no bridges. Instead, riders relied upon familiar fords where the water normally remained shallow. After heavy rain, those same crossings could become unpredictable. The current tugged gently at a horse's legs. Water splashed against saddlebags. Loose branches floated downstream, carried by the rushing water. Crossing safely required patience rather than haste. Both horse and rider trusted one another completely. Summer presented its own quiet trials. Across Nevada's deserts, the heat seemed endless. The sun climbed steadily higher until even the rocks radiated warmth. Mirages shimmered upon the horizon, creating the illusion of distant lakes that disappeared as soon as one approached. Water became precious. Every station along these dry stretches carefully maintained wells or stored supplies whenever possible. The riders learned to recognize the signs of exhaustion, not only in themselves but in their horses. A slower pace, heavier breathing, a reluctance to continue climbing. The horses often noticed these changes before the riders did. Experienced station keepers watched every arriving animal carefully. If a horse appeared overly tired, it received water, rest, and gentle care before being asked to work again. Autumn brought calmer weather to much of the route. The intense summer heat faded. Cottonwood trees turned brilliant shades of yellow beside winding rivers. Cool mornings filled the valleys with soft mist. Many riders considered these among the most beautiful weeks of the year. The changing leaves reminded everyone that another winter slowly approached. And winter transformed the trail completely. In the mountains, snow covered familiar landmarks. Trails that had been easy to follow during summer sometimes disappeared beneath deep drifts. Branches bent beneath fresh snow. Frozen streams glittered beneath pale sunlight. The air became remarkably still. Each hoofstep produced a quiet crunch against the frozen ground. Some mornings began so cold that every breath drifted before horse and rider like tiny clouds. Leather stiffened. Water buckets froze overnight. Station keepers rose early to break thin sheets of ice so their horses could drink. Travel continued, more carefully, more slowly, but it continued. Wind often proved just as challenging as snow. Across open country, powerful gusts swept unhindered across the prairie. Dust rose into the air, briefly hiding the trail. Loose hats threatened to disappear into the distance. The horses lowered their heads instinctively, leaning into the steady pressure while continuing forward with quiet determination. Perhaps the greatest challenge was not any single storm, but simple fatigue. The Pony Express depended upon speed. Although riders changed horses frequently, they themselves continued for many miles before another rider accepted the mochila. Hours spent concentrating upon the trail demanded constant attention. The rhythm of hoofbeats, the movement of the horse, the endless landscape passing beneath the wide western sky, all required quiet focus. Station keepers understood this. When riders arrived, a cup of hot coffee or a quick meal sometimes meant far more than food alone. It offered a brief chance to gather strength before continuing onward. Despite popular stories, encounters with wild animals were usually uncommon. The American frontier certainly supported remarkable wildlife. Bison grazed across portions of the plains. Pronghorn antelope bounded effortlessly through open grasslands. Elk wandered mountain forests. Coyotes called beneath moonlit skies. Occasionally, riders spotted wolves moving cautiously across distant hills. Most animals preferred avoiding people whenever possible. They quietly continued their own lives as horse and rider passed through. The same was often true of the people living along the route. The Pony Express crossed lands occupied by many different communities. Settlers built farms and towns. Native nations continued living throughout much of the frontier, following traditions rooted in these landscapes for generations. Traders, travelers, soldiers, immigrants, and local residents all shared portions of the same vast country. At times, particularly during periods of regional conflict and growing tensions in the American West, parts of the trail became more uncertain. Riders remained alert, and routes or stations were occasionally adjusted when conditions required. Even so, the overwhelming majority of miles passed quietly. More often than not, the greatest companions were simply the wind, the horse, and the open landscape itself. Perhaps that is what makes the Pony Express so remarkable. Its riders were not constantly overcoming dramatic obstacles. Instead, they accepted whatever the day offered. Rain or sunshine, snow or clear skies, heat or bitter cold. Each challenge became another ordinary part of an extraordinary job. When the weather improved, they continued. When storms arrived, they continued. When rivers rose, they continued. One careful mile after another, one fresh horse after another, one relay station after another. The letters inside the leather mochila rarely knew whether they had crossed blazing deserts, snow-covered mountains, or windswept prairies. Yet every safely delivered message carried within it the quiet efforts of countless people and horses who had patiently adapted to whatever nature placed before them. And perhaps in that quiet perseverance lay the true strength of the Pony Express, not in racing fearlessly across the frontier, but in rising each morning, looking toward the next horizon, and continuing the journey. For most of history, a letter was far more than a piece of folded paper. It carried voices, promises, business agreements, family news, expressions of love, words of comfort, and sometimes real life-changing decisions. Before the Pony Express, sending a message across the American continent demanded remarkable patience. A letter leaving the East Coast often traveled by stagecoach, steamboat, wagon, and ship before finally reaching California. Weeks passed, sometimes months. By the time news arrived, circumstances had often already changed. A merchant might receive instructions long after a business opportunity had disappeared. A family celebrating the birth of a child might not hear congratulations until that child was already learning to crawl. Government officials struggled to respond quickly to events unfolding thousands of miles away. Distance shaped nearly every aspect of life. The Pony Express did not eliminate that distance, but it made America feel smaller. For the first time, messages could cross the continent in roughly 10 days. Today, that may not sound especially fast, but in 1860, it seemed almost miraculous. Imagine a father living in New York whose son had traveled west during the California gold rush. Months might pass without hearing anything. Every visit to the local post office carried hope and uncertainty. Then one morning, a letter finally arrived. The familiar handwriting on the envelope immediately eased months of worry. Inside, perhaps the son described finding steady work in Sacramento. Perhaps he wrote about learning to farm instead of searching for gold. Perhaps he simply wished his family good health and promised to return home someday. The words themselves may have filled only a few pages, yet to the family receiving them, they meant everything. The Pony Express carried thousands of deeply personal stories like these. Some letters contained joyful news, a marriage proposal, the birth of a child, a successful harvest, the opening of a new business. Others carried more difficult messages, news of illness, financial hardship, or the quiet sorrow of losing someone far away. Each envelope represented someone's hopes, fears, or dreams. To the writers, every mochila weighed about the same, but emotionally, no two mailbags were ever equal. Businesses quickly recognized the value of faster communication. Merchants in California depended upon supplies shipped from eastern factories. Banks needed current financial information. Insurance companies required timely reports. Newspapers eagerly awaited stories from Washington, New York, and other eastern cities. A newspaper delayed by several weeks no longer contained current events. It contained history. The Pony Express helped reduce that delay dramatically. Editors watched eagerly for arriving riders. As soon as fresh dispatches reached town, printers hurried to prepare new editions. Citizens gathered to read the latest developments from across the country. In an age before radio, television, or the internet, newspapers connected communities to the wider world. Every faster delivery mattered. Government officials also depended heavily upon reliable mail. The United States was expanding rapidly. New territories joined the nation. New settlements appeared almost every month. Officials in Washington needed regular communication with governors, military commanders, judges, and postal workers scattered across the frontier. Important documents could not simply wait for months. Policies affecting thousands of people often relied upon timely correspondence. One of the Pony Express's most significant responsibilities came during the presidential election of 1860. The nation stood at a difficult crossroads. Political disagreements had grown increasingly serious. Questions surrounding the future of slavery, the balance between free and slave states, and the unity of the country dominated public discussion. When the election results became known in the East, Americans living in California desperately wanted the news. Without the Pony Express, they might have waited weeks before learning who would become the nation's next president. Instead, the results traveled westward with remarkable speed. The writers carried not only election return but reassurance that distant communities remained connected to the same national conversation. Even though Americans lived thousands of miles apart, they could now share important news within days rather than months. That sense of connection mattered deeply. The Pony Express also carried military reports, legal documents, maps, contracts, and official government correspondence. Every carefully sealed envelope represented trust. The sender trusted the postal system. The postal system trusted the riders. The riders trusted the station keepers. The station keepers trusted the horses. An entire chain of responsibility stretched across nearly 2,000 miles. Remarkably few people ever saw the complete journey. Someone writing a letter in Boston would never meet the rider crossing Nevada. A station keeper in Nebraska would never know the family waiting anxiously in San Francisco. Yet each person contributed quietly to the same shared purpose. The leather maquila itself reflected this careful organization. It contained 4 locked pockets, each designed to hold different categories of mail. Letters remained organized throughout the journey, despite changing horses dozens of times and passing through countless relay stations. Whenever a rider arrived, the mochila moved from one saddle to the next without disturbing its precious contents. The letters rested securely inside, protected from dust, rain, and the constant motion of the trail. Of course, not every item carried by the Pony Express was deeply personal. Some envelopes contained invoices, shipping receipts, legal notices, routine business records. Yet even these ordinary papers helped build growing communities across the American West. A store could order supplies. A farmer could settle accounts. A banker could authorize a transaction. Small pieces of paper quietly kept commerce moving. Looking back today, it is easy to focus upon the speed of the Pony Express. 10 days across America, an astonishing achievement. But perhaps speed was never its greatest accomplishment. Its greatest accomplishment was confidence. People began believing that communication could be dependable, that distance did not always have to mean isolation, that families separated by mountains and deserts could remain connected, that businesses could make informed decisions, that government could function more effectively across an expanding nation. For 18 remarkable months, the Pony Express became a symbol of that confidence. Each departing rider carried far more than ink and paper. He carried reassurance, hope, curiosity, responsibility. Every letter represented someone waiting, waiting for an answer, waiting for good news, waiting for forgiveness, waiting for opportunity, or simply waiting to know that a loved one, living somewhere beyond the next mountain range, was still safe. Perhaps that quiet hope explains why the Pony Express has remained so memorable long after its final ride. The horses have long since grown silent. The relay stations have weathered with time. The riders became part of history. Yet the simple human desire that filled every leather mailbag to reach someone far away remains exactly the same today. History has a curious way of turning ordinary people into legends. Over time, stories grow. Small details become larger. Simple moments become heroic adventures. The Pony Express riders were no exception. Many of the names remembered today are surrounded by colorful tales, some carefully documented, others passed from one generation to the next until fact and folklore became difficult to separate. Yet perhaps the most remarkable truth is simpler than any legend. None of these writers believed they were becoming famous. They were simply doing their jobs. One of the best known names connected with the Pony Express is William Frederick Cody, remembered by history as Buffalo Bill. When the Pony Express began in 1860, Cody was only a young teenager. According to his own later recollections, he rode for the Pony Express after an older rider was injured, carrying mail across portions of the Nebraska route. Some historians continue to debate exactly how many rides he completed. The surviving records are incomplete. Like many events from the American frontier, not every detail was carefully preserved. What seems clear is that Cody became deeply familiar with frontier life at an early age. His experiences riding horses, traveling long distances, and working across the plains helped shape the skills that later made him one of the most recognizable figures of the American West. Long before large audiences watched his famous Wild West performances, he was simply another young rider following a familiar trail beneath an endless sky. Another frequently remembered rider was Robert Pony Bob Haslam. Unlike some stories that became exaggerated over time, Haslam's remarkable endurance is supported by historical accounts. On one famous occasion, after discovering that other riders could not complete their scheduled sections because of dangerous conditions, Haslam continued far beyond his normal assignment. Instead of riding roughly 75 miles, he remained in the saddle for well over 300 miles. The journey lasted many exhausting hours. His horses changed repeatedly at relay stations, but he himself continued onward. When he finally completed the route, both rider and horses had accomplished something truly extraordinary. Yet even this remarkable achievement did not make him wealthy. Years later, Haslam lived a quiet life far removed from the fame that gradually surrounded the Pony Express. His story reminds us that history's heroes often return to ordinary lives once their remarkable moments have passed. Perhaps the most mysterious rider associated with the Pony Express was Johnny Fry, only 18 years old. Fry carried the honor of making the very first westbound Pony Express ride from St. Joseph, Missouri, on April 3rd, 1860. Imagine the excitement that morning. Crowds gathered to watch. Business leaders looked on with hopeful anticipation. Newspapers eagerly prepared reports describing this bold experiment. The leather mochila rested securely upon the saddle. Fresh horses waited farther west. As the signal was given, Johnny Fry urged his horse forward. Within moments, he disappeared down the trail, beginning a journey that would soon capture the nation's imagination. For Fry, however, fame proved tragically brief. Only a year later, during the opening months of the American Civil War, he enlisted in the Union Army. He was killed in 1861 while serving as a soldier. His life reminds us how quickly the nation changed during those turbulent years. The frontier, the Pony Express, and the coming Civil War all became chapters within the same generation's story. Many riders never achieved widespread recognition at all. Some left behind only brief mentions in company records. Others appeared occasionally in local newspapers. Many remained completely anonymous. Their names disappeared, even while their work continued shaping history. Perhaps they preferred it that way. The Pony Express rewarded reliability far more than celebrity. The ideal rider was not the loudest, nor the most boastful. He was simply dependable. He arrived when expected, changed horses quickly, protected the mail, and completed his route again and again and again. One interesting feature shared by many riders was their age. Most were remarkably young by modern standards. Many had not yet reached their 20th birthday. Growing up on farms, ranches, or frontier settlements had prepared them for responsibility at an early stage of life. They understood hard work because they had known little else. Long days outdoors, caring for livestock, repairing fences, helping support their families. These experiences quietly prepared them for the demanding routine of the Pony Express. Of course, not every applicant succeeded. Some discovered that the work proved harder than expected. The weather, the long hours, the constant concentration, the physical demands of riding, all combined to create a profession requiring unusual discipline. Only those who accepted the routine remained. Interestingly, the riders themselves often spoke more highly of their horses than of their own accomplishments. A dependable horse earned lasting respect. Some riders remembered favorite mounts years after the Pony Express had ended. They recalled which horses climbed mountain trails most confidently, which preferred long stretches of open prairie, which seemed to sense approaching storms before dark clouds appeared. These quiet partnerships between rider and horse became some of the most important relationships on the trail. Although later novels and motion pictures often portrayed Pony Express riders as fearless adventurers, constantly escaping dramatic danger, the daily reality remained much quieter. Most rides passed without incident. A successful journey usually meant nothing unusual had happened at all. The mail arrived safely. The schedule remained intact. The horses stayed healthy. The station keepers waited with fresh mounts. In many ways, that quiet reliability represented the company's greatest success. Perhaps that is why it can be difficult to identify a single greatest Pony Express rider. Was it the one who rode the farthest, the fastest, the first, or perhaps the one whose name has simply been forgotten, yet who faithfully completed hundreds of ordinary rides without attracting any attention? History often celebrates spectacular moments, but lasting achievements are usually built upon consistency. Every famous rider depended upon dozens of lesser-known companions. Every celebrated journey relied upon station keepers, blacksmiths, cooks, stable hands, and countless others whose names rarely appeared in print. Together, they created something far greater than any one individual could accomplish alone. Today, visitors exploring Old Pony Express Station sometimes pause before photographs or paintings of the riders. Young faces gaze back from another century. Simple clothing, wide-brimmed hats, weathered saddles, calm expressions. It is tempting to imagine that they somehow knew history would remember them. Most likely, they did not. They were simply young people with responsibilities to fulfill before the next sunrise. And perhaps that makes their story even more meaningful. The legends grew later, the statues came later, the books, paintings, and films all came later. But on the trail itself, there was only another waiting horse, another stretch of open country, and another rider quietly disappearing toward the western horizon. The Pony Express never truly slept. While one rider finished his route, another was already preparing to begin. Somewhere along the nearly 2,000 miles of trail, horses were always waiting, station keepers were tending the fire, and a leather mochila filled with letters was moving steadily toward its destination. To understand the Pony Express, it helps to slow the journey down. Rather than imagining the entire route across America, imagine just one ordinary day. A single rider, a single section of trail, a few hours in the saddle. The day begins long before sunrise. The cabin is quiet. Only the soft crackling of the fireplace breaks the silence. Outside, the prairie still rests beneath a blanket of darkness, while countless stars shimmer overhead. The air is cool enough that every breath becomes a faint cloud drifting into the night. The rider wakes without the need for an alarm. His schedule is determined by the mail, not by comfort. He dresses simply: a sturdy shirt, wool trousers, strong leather boots, a hat to shield his face from the coming sun. There is little ceremony, no speeches, no audience, only another day's work. A station keeper pours a cup of hot coffee into a tin mug. Perhaps there is fresh bread baked the evening before, maybe a slice of salt pork, or a small serving of beans left from yesterday's meal. The breakfast is modest, but filling enough to begin the ride. Conversation remains brief. There is no need for many words. Both men understand the routine. Outside, the horses are already awake. One stamps gently against the ground. Another shakes its mane as the leather bridle is carefully fastened into place. The rider runs a hand along the horse's neck almost without thinking. Perhaps he has ridden this particular horse before. Perhaps this is their first journey together. Either way, trust must form immediately. The leather saddle is checked one final time, the stirrups adjusted, the reins gathered. Then comes the mochila. The familiar leather mail cover is carefully placed over the saddle. Its locked pockets hold letters, newspapers, official documents, and countless private hopes traveling west or east across the continent. Once secured, the rider climbs into the saddle. The station keeper steps back with a gentle squeeze of the reins. The journey begins. The horse settles quickly into a steady gallop. Hoofbeats echo softly across the quiet prairie. Behind them, the station grows smaller with every passing minute until it disappears completely into the morning light. Soon, only horse and rider, tsai, and trail remain. The sun slowly rises. Golden light spreads across the grasslands. Long shadows stretch behind scattered cottonwood trees. Birds begin their morning songs. A small herd of pronghorn antelope watches curiously before bounding effortlessly across the open plain. The rider notices these things almost unconsciously. He has seen similar mornings many times before, yet each sunrise remains slightly different. The trail demands steady attention, loose stones, shallow creek crossings, occasional fallen branches. The rider guides his horse with small movements rather than dramatic gestures. The animal understands the work as well as its rider. Together, they move almost as one. After several miles, another traveler appears ahead, a family guiding an ox-drawn wagon westward. The children notice the approaching rider first. They wave excitedly. The parents guide the wagon slightly aside, allowing room on the narrow trail. The Pony Express rider tips his hat politely while continuing forward. Within moments, both parties continue their separate journeys. Perhaps they never meet again. Late in the morning, the wind begins to strengthen. Tall prairie grass bends gently beneath its steady pressure. Clouds drift lazily across the enormous sky. The rider pulls his hat a little lower against the breeze. His horse continues without hesitation. Neither seems hurried, yet every minute matters. Eventually, the next relay station comes into view. At first, it is little more than a tiny cabin beside a corral. Thin smoke rises from its chimney. As horse and rider approach, the waiting station keeper is already leading a fresh horse toward the mounting block. Everything happens with remarkable efficiency. The rider swings from one saddle. The mochila is lifted, placed onto the waiting horse. The girth tightened. The rider climbs back into the saddle. Perhaps someone offers a quick drink of water. Maybe a few words are exchanged. Trails dry, rivers low, storm moving in from the west. Simple information, useful information, nothing more. Within less than 2 minutes, the rider is gone again. Behind him, the tired horse is gently rubbed down before receiving water and fresh hay. Ahead, another stretch of trail waits. As afternoon arrives, the sunlight grows warmer. Heat shimmers gently above the ground. Grasshoppers leap away from the horse's path. A hawk circles high overhead, searching the fields below. The steady rhythm of riding becomes almost peaceful. There is time to think. Or perhaps, time to think about nothing at all. Only the sound of hoofbeats, the wind, the endless horizon. Many hours pass this way, without excitement, without drama, simply moving forward. As evening approaches, the light begins to soften. The western sky turns shades of amber and gold. Long shadows return across the prairie. The horse's breathing remains steady. The rider knows his assigned section is nearly complete. Finally, another relay station appears. This one marks the end of his day's ride. Another young rider already waits beside a fresh horse. The exchange is even quicker than before. The mochila changes hands. The new rider mounts immediately. Within moments, the male is once again racing toward the next horizon. The first rider watches only briefly before turning his attention elsewhere. His work is finished for today. He removes his gloves, stretches tired muscles. The station keeper offers supper, perhaps thick stew simmering over the fire, fresh bread, coffee. Simple food always seems especially satisfying after a long ride. Outside, the horses settle quietly into the corral. The evening grows cooler. Crickets begin singing in the grass. Far above, the first stars appear one by one. Inside the cabin, conversation is unhurried. Someone speaks about tomorrow's weather. Another mentions travelers seen earlier along the trail. The day's ride is discussed only briefly. It was, after all, an ordinary day. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing. The Pony Express was not built upon extraordinary days. It was built upon ordinary ones, upon riders who woke before dawn, upon horses ready to run, upon station keepers waiting with fresh coffee and fresh mounts, upon thousands of quiet routines repeated with remarkable care. Somewhere beyond the darkness, another rider is already carrying the same mochila toward another station. The journey continues without pause. One rider rests, another begins. And through that endless rhythm of sunrise, hoofbeats, and sunset, the mail moves steadily across America, one ordinary day at a time. For 18 remarkable months, the Pony Express represented the fastest communication system in the United States. Its riders crossed rivers, climbed mountains, galloped across endless prairies, braved deserts, changed horses more than 100 times between Missouri and California. It seemed almost impossible to imagine a faster way to carry news across the continent. Yet, even as the Pony Express captured the nation's imagination, another invention was quietly spreading westward. It did not ride horses. It did not rest at relay stations. It needed no saddles, no corral, and no riders. It traveled at the speed of electricity. The telegraph had already begun changing communication in the eastern United States years before the Pony Express was established. Invented and refined during the 1830s and 1840s, the system allowed messages to travel almost instantly along wires stretched between distant towns. Instead of carrying entire letters, telegraph operators transmitted messages using short and long electrical signals known as Morse code. Each pattern represented a letter. Each letter formed words, and those words traveled farther and faster than anyone had imagined possible only a generation earlier. In cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago, the telegraph quickly became an essential part of everyday life. Business owners depended upon it. Newspapers relied upon it. Railroads coordinated their schedules with it. Government officials exchanged information in minutes rather than weeks. But in 1860, one enormous challenge remained. The wires did not yet reach California. Between the growing settlements of the Midwest and the Pacific coast stretched nearly 2,000 miles of mountains, rivers, deserts, and open prairie. Building a telegraph across such a vast landscape seemed almost as ambitious as creating the Pony Express itself. Thousands of wooden poles would be required, miles upon miles of iron wire, countless workers, wagons carrying supplies, surveyors planning routes, crews digging holes through rocky ground, others climbing ladders to secure heavy wire high above the earth. The project demanded remarkable organization. Interestingly, some portions of the planned telegraph followed routes already familiar to the Pony Express. The writers had demonstrated that reliable communication across the continent was possible. Now engineers hoped to replace moving horses with unmoving wires. As construction advanced westward, teams worked steadily despite difficult conditions. Across the plains, crews hauled poles by wagon before raising them one by one against the open sky. In mountain valleys, workers searched carefully for routes that balanced practicality with safety. Deserts presented additional challenges. Water remained scarce. Supplies traveled slowly. Summer heat tested both workers and animals alike. Yet progress continued, pole by pole, wire by wire, mile after mile. While construction moved forward, the Pony Express continued its daily work without interruption. Each rider understood only his own section of trail. Some may have occasionally noticed telegraph crews working nearby, freshly planted poles standing where none had existed before, wagons loaded with wire, groups of laborers resting beside temporary camps. Perhaps the riders wondered how quickly the new system would spread, or perhaps they simply continued riding, focused upon the next relay station. The two systems briefly existed side by side. One represented movement, the other, connection. One relied upon horses galloping across open country. The other depended upon invisible pulses traveling through slender strands of metal For a short time, both served the same purpose, keeping distant Americans connected. Then, on October 24th, 1861, history quietly changed. After months of determined effort, the first transcontinental telegraph line was completed. For the first time, messages could travel electronically from the eastern United States to California. What had required roughly 10 days by Pony Express could now happen in minutes. The achievement was extraordinary. News spread rapidly across the nation. Newspapers celebrated the completion of one of the greatest engineering accomplishments of its era. Government officials immediately recognized its importance. Businesses eagerly embraced the new technology. Families discovered they could send urgent messages far more quickly than ever before. The world had suddenly become smaller. The effect upon the Pony Express was immediate. Almost overnight, its greatest advantage disappeared. No horse, regardless of its speed, could outrun electricity. The company that operated the Pony Express had always faced financial challenges, maintaining hundreds of stations, feeding hundreds of horses, paying riders, repairing buildings, purchasing equipment, transporting supplies, all required enormous expense. The company had accepted those costs because it offered something no one else could: speed. Once the telegraph matched and greatly surpassed that speed, the business could no longer survive. There was no dramatic final race, no desperate attempt to outrun the wires, no great contest between horse and machine. Instead, the transition happened quietly. The telegraph simply performed the same task more quickly. Technology had advanced. As it often does, it transformed the world with surprising speed. For many riders, the news likely arrived with mixed emotions. The work that had filled their days, the routine they knew so well, would soon end. Some returned to ranching. Others joined stagecoach companies. Many found entirely different occupations across the growing American West. The horses also found new purposes. Some carried travelers. Others worked on farms or freight lines. The relay stations gradually became quieter. A few continued serving stagecoaches. Others stood empty until weather slowly reclaimed them. Yet there is no sadness in this story, only change. The Pony Express had never been intended to last forever. From the very beginning, it served as a bridge between two eras. It connected a nation while another technology slowly reached across the continent. Without the Pony Express, the months before the telegraph's completion would have felt far longer. Its riders carried the country through an important moment of transition. Today, we often think of new inventions replacing older ones, steam replacing sails, automobiles replacing horse-drawn wagons, computers replacing typewriters. The Pony Express reminds us that progress is rarely about failure. Sometimes one remarkable achievement simply prepares the way for another. The riders did not lose to the telegraph. They completed the work they had been created to do. For 18 unforgettable months, they proved that Americans expected faster communication and were willing to build extraordinary systems to achieve it. Then, when the wires finally stretched from coast to coast, the horses quietly stepped aside. Their race had been won, even if they were no longer needed to run it. Every journey, no matter how remarkable, eventually reaches its final destination. The Pony Express was no exception. Its story had been filled with determination, careful planning, and thousands upon thousands of miles traveled by horse and rider. Yet from the very beginning, its future had always been uncertain. The company behind the Pony Express, Russell, Majors, and Waddell, had accepted enormous financial risks in creating the service, building nearly 200 relay stations, purchasing hundreds of horses, hiring riders, employing station keepers, transporting food, equipment, and supplies across vast stretches of the frontier. All of this required far more money than most people realized. Every successful delivery represented not only a triumph of organization, but also another day of considerable expense. The company hoped that government contracts would eventually provide the steady income needed to support the operation. Such contracts had long helped stagecoach companies and mail carriers survive across the expanding nation. Winning one would have made the Pony Express far more secure. But those hopes never fully became reality, although the service earned widespread admiration, and newspapers praised its remarkable speed. Admiration alone could not pay wages or feed horses. Each passing month brought new financial pressures. At the same time, the nation itself was entering one of the most difficult periods in its history. During 1860 and 1861, political tensions continued growing between the northern and southern states. The presidential election, public disagreements, questions surrounding the future of the Union, all created deep uncertainty across the country. Then, in April 1861, the American Civil War began. Almost overnight, the nation's priorities changed. Government attention shifted toward raising armies, organizing transportation, protecting supply lines, and managing a conflict that would soon affect nearly every American family. Communication remained important, perhaps more important than ever, but the methods of communication were changing. The transcontinental telegraph now carried urgent military messages almost instantly across great distances. Its value became immediately obvious. Meanwhile, the Pony Express continued operating for a short while longer. The riders still mounted fresh horses. Station keepers still prepared meals. The familiar rhythm of hoofbeats continued across the plains and mountains. To those working along the route, daily life probably seemed much the same. The horses certainly did not know that history was changing around them. They simply ran when asked. The station keepers continued chopping wood, repairing fences, and waiting for the next rider. The riders themselves likely focused only upon reaching the next relay station safely and on time. Sometimes, history changes quietly. The people living through it do not immediately recognize that they are witnessing the end of an era. That seems to have been true for the Pony Express. On October the 26th, 1861, only 2 days after the transcontinental telegraph officially connected the nation, the Pony Express carried its final mail. There were no grand ceremonies marking the occasion. No large crowds gathered to applaud the last departing rider. No brass bands played farewell songs. Instead, another mochila was loaded, another horse saddled, another rider set out across the familiar trail. The mail was delivered, the route completed, and then the work simply stopped. After 18 months of continuous service, the Pony Express quietly passed into history. Its stations gradually found new purposes. Some became stagecoach stops, others were sold to settlers moving west. A few remained occupied for years. Many were eventually abandoned. Wind, rain, snow, and passing seasons slowly weathered the wooden buildings. Today, only a small number survive. Standing quietly across the American landscape, they remind visitors of a brief but remarkable chapter in the nation's history. The horses also returned to more ordinary lives. Many entered stagecoach service. Others worked on ranches. Some spent their remaining years pulling wagons or helping farmers plow fields. Their extraordinary days of carrying urgent mail across the frontier had ended. The riders scattered in many different directions. Some remained in transportation. Others joined the military during the Civil War. Some settled into farming or ranching. A few later shared stories of their experiences. Many rarely spoke about them at all. To them, the Pony Express had simply been one chapter of a much larger life. Interestingly, because the Pony Express existed for such a short time, relatively few people actually worked for it. Historians estimate that only a small number of riders served during its entire operation. Compared with other frontier businesses that lasted for decades, the Pony Express remained a remarkably brief experiment. Yet its influence stretched far beyond those 18 months. People remembered it because it represented something larger than itself. It demonstrated what determination, careful organization, and human cooperation could accomplish across an enormous continent. It showed that Americans no longer accepted slow communication as inevitable. They expected better, faster, more reliable. The Pony Express helped create those expectations. In many ways, it became the final great chapter of transportation by horseback, before technology transformed communication forever. It stood with one foot in the old world and one in the new. For centuries, important news had traveled only as fast as a horse, a ship, or a person could carry it. After the telegraph, that ancient rhythm changed forever. Electricity replaced hoofbeats, wires replaced trails, messages no longer depended upon weather, rivers, or mountain passes. Yet something valuable disappeared as well. There is a certain quiet beauty in imagining a single rider carrying handwritten letters beneath an open sky. Each message traveled physically across rivers, valleys, forests, and deserts. The journey itself became part of the story. Today, our messages arrive almost instantly. We rarely think about the distance they have crossed. Perhaps that is why the Pony Express continues to capture our imagination. It reminds us that communication was once something we could almost see. A rider approaching through a cloud of dust, a fresh horse waiting at the station, a leather mochila filled with carefully folded letters, a family watching hopefully from a cabin doorway. The arrival of news was an event. It had weight, it had sound, it had footsteps and hoofbeats. When the final Pony Express rider completed his route in October of 1861, he almost certainly did not know that generations of Americans would still remember the journey. To him, it was simply another ride, another day, another successful delivery. Perhaps that quiet ending was perfectly fitting, for the Pony Express had never sought greatness through spectacle. It achieved greatness through faithful service. 1 mile, 1 horse, 1 letter, and 1 rider at a time. The last Pony Express rider completed his journey more than a century and a half ago. The hoofbeats faded. The relay stations grew quiet. The leather maquilas were carefully set aside. Life moved forward. Railroads stretched across the continent. Telegraph wires multiplied. Telephones arrived. Automobiles replaced horses. Airplanes crossed the same distances in hours instead of days. And eventually, messages began traveling invisibly through satellites and fiber optic cables. Yet somehow, the Pony Express was never forgotten. Many businesses disappeared from history after they closed. Few people remember the names of ordinary stagecoach companies or freight lines that once crisscrossed the American frontier. The Pony Express lasted only 18 months, and still, people continue telling its story. Why? Perhaps because it represented far more than a mail service. It became a symbol of determination, of courage, of connection, of a nation trying to bridge the enormous distances that separated its people. As the years passed, former riders occasionally shared memories of their experiences. Some spoke before local historical societies. Others answered questions from curious newspaper reporters. A few wrote their recollections many decades after their rides had ended. Naturally, memory can become imperfect over time. Stories grow richer with repeated telling. Small adventures become larger. Quiet moments become dramatic. Historians have carefully compared these personal memories with company records, newspaper accounts, and official documents. Sometimes the stories matched remarkably well. Other times, details proved more difficult to confirm. Yet even where legends grew, they reflected something genuine. People wanted to remember the Pony Express. Across the American West, communities also began preserving places connected with its history. Old relay stations that might once have been considered ordinary frontier buildings gradually became treasured landmarks. Instead of allowing every structure to disappear, citizens restored some of them. Fresh roofs replaced weathered ones. Broken fences were rebuilt. Artifacts were collected. Visitors arrived to learn about the remarkable network that had once linked Missouri with California. Walking through one of these preserved stations today feels surprisingly peaceful. The rooms are modest, simple wooden tables, iron cooking pots, rough beds, leather saddles, lanterns hanging quietly from sturdy beams. Nothing appears luxurious. Everything reflects usefulness. One can almost imagine a station keeper placing another log upon the fire while listening for distant hoofbeats outside. Museums across the United States also began collecting objects connected with the Pony Express: a worn horseshoe, a carefully preserved mochila, letters carried along the route, old maps showing relay stations stretching westward across the frontier, photographs of surviving riders taken late in life. These ordinary objects became extraordinary because they survived. Each carries its own quiet story. Perhaps the most remarkable artifacts are the letters themselves. Many still exist. Their envelopes bear stamps and postmarks from another century. The paper has yellowed gently with age. The ink has faded slightly, yet the words remain. Messages written by people who could never have imagined that strangers would someday admire the envelopes carrying their ordinary correspondence. A simple family letter, a business contract, a newspaper dispatch. Each became part of history simply because it traveled aboard the Pony Express. Every year, history enthusiasts continue retracing portions of the original route. Some travel by horseback, others explore by car or on foot. Roadside markers identify places where relay stations once stood. Quiet monuments overlook rivers once crossed by riders. Trails still wind through valleys where hoofbeats echoed long ago. In some places, little remains beyond open prairie and wide skies. Yet perhaps that is enough. The landscape itself remembers. The hills remain. The rivers continue flowing. The mountains still stand exactly where they stood in 1860. Only the riders have gone. One particularly meaningful tradition continues even today. From time to time, organizations organize commemorative Pony Express rides. Modern horsemen and horsewomen carry specially prepared mail along portions of the historic route, using relay riders much like those of the original service. Fresh horses wait at designated stations. The mochila changes hands. The journey continues. Not because modern mail depends upon it, but because the tradition reminds people of an extraordinary chapter in American history. Children watching these events often experience the same excitement that frontier families must have felt more than 160 years ago. A rider appears in the distance. The horse gallops closer. Dust rises behind pounding hooves. For a brief moment, history feels wonderfully close. The Pony Express has also inspired countless books, paintings, songs, films, and television programs. Artists have long been captivated by the image of a lone rider crossing vast western landscapes beneath dramatic skies. Writers have explored both the documented history and the legends that grew around it. Filmmakers have sometimes added exciting adventures that never actually occurred. While these stories may not always be historically perfect, they demonstrate the lasting place the Pony Express holds in the American imagination. Yet perhaps the greatest legacy cannot be found in museums, monuments, or works of art. It lives quietly within an idea. The idea that people separated by enormous distances should still remain connected, that communication matters, that families deserve to hear from one another. That important news should travel quickly, that communities become stronger when information flows freely between them. These values remain just as meaningful today as they were in 1860. Only the methods have changed. The Pony Express also reminds us that remarkable achievements are often temporary. Its riders worked for only 18 months. Many assumed their efforts would soon be forgotten. Instead, their brief service became timeless. Sometimes, history remembers not the longest-lasting accomplishments, but those that captured the hopes of an entire generation. As evening settles across the old Pony Express trail today, the prairie grasses still sway beneath gentle winds. Cottonwood leaves continue whispering beside quiet rivers. Mountain peaks glow softly beneath the setting sun. Coyotes call across distant valleys. The stars emerge above the same wide skies that guided riders through the darkness long ago. If you stand quietly enough, it becomes easy to imagine a horse appearing over the next rise, a young rider leaning forward in the saddle, a leather mochila resting securely across a faithful horse, carrying letters, dreams, and the hopes of a growing nation toward another waiting horizon. Now, our journey is nearly complete. For many miles, we have ridden beside the Pony Express. We have watched the first stations rise upon the frontier, met the young riders who accepted demanding work with quiet determination, followed faithful horses across rolling prairies, rushing rivers, towering mountains, and wide deserts, waited beside lonely relay stations where lanterns glowed warmly against the evening darkness. And together, we have witnessed both the remarkable rise and the gentle ending of one of the most memorable chapters in American history. Yet perhaps before we leave this trail behind, it is worth lingering here for just a little longer, not to think about speed or business or technology, but simply to appreciate the quiet beauty of this vanished world. Imagine that it is late evening in the autumn of 1860. The day's final rider has already disappeared beyond the western horizon. The last golden light rests softly upon the prairie. Tall grasses sway gently beneath an almost silent breeze. Somewhere nearby, a horse lowers its head to drink from a clear stream. The station keeper has finished the day's chores. Fresh hay fills the stable. The leather saddles hang neatly upon their pegs. A small fire burns inside the cabin. Its warm glow spills gently through the window, becoming a tiny beacon within the immense darkness of the frontier. There's nowhere else to hurry, nothing else to deliver, only stillness. The sky gradually deepens from blue to violet, and finally to a rich velvet black. One by one, the stars appear. At first only a handful, then dozens, then hundreds. Soon, the heavens become crowded with countless points of light stretching from one horizon to the other. Without city lights to dim their brilliance, the Milky Way shines like a pale river flowing across the night sky. The same stars watched over native nations long before the Pony Express existed. They watched over early explorers, fur traders, settlers, stagecoach drivers, railroad workers, And they continue watching over the land today. Some things change remarkably quickly, others remain beautifully constant. The prairie itself breathes slowly beneath the moonlight. Crickets sing quietly among the grasses. An owl glides silently between distant cottonwood trees. Far away, a coyote calls into the night. Another answers. Then silence gently settles once more. Inside the station, someone places another log upon the fire. The flames brighten briefly before returning to their steady glow. A kettle warms beside the hearth. Perhaps tomorrow another rider will arrive before sunrise. Perhaps snow will fall. Perhaps the weather will remain clear. No one knows. The frontier has always asked its people to accept uncertainty with patience. Perhaps that is one of the greatest lessons left behind by the Pony Express. Its riders could never control the weather. They could not command rivers to remain calm. They could not ask mountains to lower their peaks or deserts to shorten their endless distances. Instead, they accepted the world exactly as they found it. Each morning, they looked toward the trail ahead, mounted their horses, and continued. There is something quietly comforting about that simple philosophy. Life often asks the same of us. We cannot predict every storm. We cannot avoid every challenge. We cannot always know what waits beyond the next hill. But like those riders, we move forward, one careful mile at a time, one thoughtful decision after another, one ordinary day quietly following the last. The Pony Express lasted only 18 months. Compared with the centuries that came before or the generations that followed, it was little more than a brief moment. And yet, some moments become timeless, not because they last forever, but because they remind us what people can accomplish when they work together toward a shared purpose. Think for a moment about everyone whose efforts made the Pony Express possible. The blacksmith, shaping another horseshoe before dawn. The carpenter, repairing a station roof after a summer storm. The cook, preparing hot coffee for a tired rider. The stable hand, brushing a faithful horse after a long gallop. The family, waiting patiently for a letter from someone they loved. The rider disappearing into the distance. Each person completed only one small part of a much larger story. No one carried the continent alone. Perhaps that is true of history itself. When we look back, we often remember famous names. Yet every generation is quietly shaped by countless ordinary people whose names never appear in books. People who simply perform their work with honesty, patience, and care. The Pony Express reminds us to notice them, to appreciate the unseen hands behind every remarkable achievement. As our own journey comes to an end, the trail begins to fade softly into memory. The hoof prints disappear beneath fresh grass. The wagon ruts slowly soften after many seasons of rain. Wooden stations weather beneath countless winters. The wind carries away the last traces of dust raised by passing horses. Nature patiently reclaims the land, and still, the story remains, not because the building survived, not because the horses remained, but because the ideas carried within those leather mailbags continue traveling even now. Hope, connection, trust, perseverance. The simple belief that no distance should prevent people from reaching one another. Tonight, if you close your eyes for just a moment, perhaps you can almost hear it, not loudly, only faintly, the distant rhythm of hoofbeats upon the prairie, steady, unhurried, growing softer with every passing moment. A rider moves toward the western horizon beneath a sky filled with stars. The horse carries its precious cargo faithfully. The station ahead already waits with fresh water and warm light, and another horse prepared to continue the journey. Everything is exactly as it should be. And now, as the fire burns lower, as the prairie grows quiet, as the stars continue their endless watch overhead, it is time for us to leave the trail as well. Thank you for spending this peaceful journey through history with Whispered History. May these stories remain with you, not as loud adventures, but as gentle reminders of the ordinary people whose quiet determination helps shape the world we know today. Until our paths cross again, may your road be peaceful, may your nights be calm, and may you always find comfort beneath the same timeless stars that once guided the riders of the Pony Express across the sleeping American frontier.